So today's subject is science, and we have an interesting mixture of panelists. And Dallas, I know you've got to go quite soon, so I thought perhaps Dallas would be a great place to start because he is a TV presenter and helps to communicate very complex scientific ideas to the plebs like us. And perhaps, Dallas, you could tell us your thoughts on science, how it's communicated, and how it is not necessarily an infallible thing.
Well, I think your introduction before you hit record was exactly as I couldn't have said it any better, really. You're absolutely right. There is a misconception about what science is. People think of very often science is a kind of an authority, and it's not that. Science is basically the way that we explore the world using the best evidence we have, and that evidence is always changing. I always say that uncertainty is the engine of science, and I think part of the problem is people tend to think of science as that thing they did at school between kind of French and geography as a subject. And I think the perception of science, you're right, it does get misunderstood, and that's a shame. And very often that's the fault of scientists. Very often scientists aren't particularly good at communicating what they do. Science is always seen as something other, like other people do. Scientists do science, and I always think that's a bit of an odd thing. And I don't have a science. Well, I do have a scientific background in that I've been working in science for 25 years or so, making programs about science and how science works. And I've been lucky in that I've worked across many different areas of science. Particularly, actually, you mentioned you meant people who didn't go, we thought we didn't go to the moon. Well, actually, that's kind of if I have an area of expertise, it's probably that. I write books on space flight history, so I can talk a little bit about that if you want. It's funny that when I give public presentations about space, and I've got a new book about on it at the moment, and I'm at the Cheltenham Science Festival. That is always a question that comes up. Did we go to the moon? And I'm not quite sure. I'd be interested what other people think. Do people really believe that, or is it just become a kind of a funny idea that people like to trot out because they want to see what people think, and it's the funny thing? People didn't really think that until kind of social media came along. It was actually an idea in the 1970s. There was a book published, I think it was called America's $1 Billion Secret by some nut job that we didn't go to the moon. And it was quickly forgotten, but social media has kind of dragged that idea out and it's become a kind of a thing again. I think the important thing is, like anything, we get our information about the world and our beliefs about the world from people we trust. And if we cease to trust institutions like science or the legal system or judicial system or the education system or whatever it is, then we kind of run into trouble. So I think institutions like science have got a really important job to do to persuade people that science isn't the enemy. Science isn't some authority. It's just a bunch of people trying to work out how stuff works in the best way that they have. And you're absolutely right. There is no definitive answer to science. Science is just a method. It is a way of it's a way of exploring nature, trying to filter out our biases and our beliefs to the best of our ability. But of course, it is fallible because people are fallible. But science is changing all the time. Nothing that we know to be correct now will be correct in 100 years' time. It's constantly changing. There is no right answer. There is only the best evidence we have at the time, and that's, I mean, to a point. If I drop my banana skin, it's going to fall down. And we're pretty sure that we understand how Newtonian gravity works. We're pretty understand sure we understand how Einstein's theory of gravities work. But we're only 99.99. There's always a chance that we're going to find something else. And the other point that you made, Sarah, so eloquently, it is like an onion. There is no end to it. We don't ever get to a point where we know everything and it's settled. So anyway, that's my kind of thoughts. Really, just echoing what you said earlier on.
What do you think about this kind of? I think one of the issues with science, I guess it's been going on for the last couple of 100 years, is we're coming back round to this recognition that a lot of indigenous small scale societies have very good scientific information about the world and how it works. And I mentioned when I was advertising the panel that I collect expedition accounts from the 1930s and 40s, and lots of them feature scientists or explorers from places like America and Europe going to places like the Amazon, finding them entirely inhospitable, and coming a cropper and having their lives saved, usually more than 3 or 4 times, by the indigenous people, and not having any understanding of the intricate complexities, the holistic nature. And I think that's something we're coming back round to. Like, I'm here in Aberdeenshire at the moment, and my daughter was telling me about how where her family have been working the land here and growing trees, they have realized now that they don't sequester carbon until 25 years of growth, and that actually they're contributing to producing carbon dioxide in those first 15 years of growth. So there's all this kind of like holistic information that without incredibly long observation of nature, we can't have. And we're so separate from nature. A scientist working in a lab surely cannot have that kind of joined up understanding of the world, because they're not actually living next to this plant or animal.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. But I think everything is context dependent. I mean, you have to look at individual cases. I mean, you're right. People have local knowledge about all kinds of things. And very often they're correct just because they've been involved in a particular thing like farming for a long time. So that kind of knowledge exists. And actually, you're right as well, because, the scientific method as a way of doing it through experimentation, as a way of testing things, is pretty new. It's only like 400 years old. We've only been doing science pretty recently. But science is the best lens we have for really kind of understanding things. Because yes, there's always anomalies. There is also we have to be careful of our own biases. And there is a logical fallacy that, and I see it quite often, that somehow, because things are very old and very ancient and very of another era, that somehow that's better. I can't remember what it's called, the argument from history, or whatever that particular logical fallacy is. But I think you have to look at each thing independently. For example, a friend of my dad's, which was a woman who believed that she had the ability to smell. I think it was Parkinson's disease. Like she got a weird smell from her husband, and she didn't know what it was, and then her husband got Parkinson, and she smelled it somewhere, and she had this belief that she could smell this. I think it was Parkinson. Maybe I'm wrong. And everyone thought she was a crackpot. Everyone thought she was mad. And then they studied her a bit closer, and lo and behold, she did have this. She did have this. She did have it. So there are. Of course, you're absolutely right, and then people will have kind of knowledge that science hasn't studied. But if you want to be thorough about things, if you really want to understand how the world works, it's very easy to say, oh yes, and this happened, and such happened, and we can go back to ancient times. But it's pretty good science for getting the best estimate, I suppose, of how a particular phenomena is working.
Yeah, I guess that's the part of it, though, isn't it? You mentioned the word like independent, looking at something independently, and I guess a lot of
Well,
ancient indigenous culture looks at
yeah.
together in context holistically.
Well, yeah, you're right. And of course, indigenous cultures would have had things like medicine and everything else. But I hear it a lot, though. I hear it a lot, people saying, oh, yes, but I use alternative medicine, and I don't want to, because I don't trust science, and I like this and that. And science has a word for, and I'm paraphrasing someone, but science has a word for um, alternative medicine that's been tested, and it's called medicine. And it's not to be disparaging of law or local knowledge and everything else. It's just, if you want to be rigorous about things, if you really want, then science is probably the best thing we have, fallible as it is, and as imprecise as it is all the time. I mean, actually, just the event I was doing now, talking about exoplanets, is a really good example. I was with Professor Sarah Seeger from MIT. Her job is to try and find life on other planets. Now, we've always supposed there was other planets beyond our solar system, but there was no way of proving it. But it's always been talked about in local science fiction, and other cultures have talked about planets. But it's only through our technology and through science that we've actually been able to physically see other planets, and the fact that now we can actually look at the light that passes through the atmosphere of planets orbiting other stars, and being able to understand the chemistry of that, and being able to understand the chemistry of exoplanet atmospheres, means that we can look for biosignatures, because we know there are certain gases that only biology produces. And that's how we understand the question, is there life beyond Earth? We don't do it by looking at fuzzy pictures of what we think are flying saucers, because that it's just it's unfalsifiable. Part of the problem, we were talking a little bit earlier about disclosure, and the current UFO flap, is there is no evidence at all. There's nothing. There's not a single bit of evidence other than people's hearsay, or stories, or grainy photos, and that's, for the science mind, it's just not good enough. You've got to have high standards, and sometimes it's not quite as interesting. I said, well, I don't. No, that's the wrong word. But the human brain is drawn to exciting stories of things, and we tend to get drawn down those aliens built the pyramids and
Well,
those.
I think the human mind is kind of drawn to try to figure things out. So the
Yes, you're right.
mysterious
Yes, yeah,
nature of things, like human beings want
yes,
to try
yeah,
to,
that's
to
exactly
work
it.
that out.
Yeah, you're exactly right. We want to find Humans love to find the answer to things. We're curious. We want to know what it is. Um, but I don't know. I think you're right that there is an increasing mistrust of science and scientists, I think. And I think that's perhaps due to the nature of technology, the fact that where once we may disagree about certain things, we kind of believed in the idea of science or education or politics. But social media and everything else has means that our ways of knowing things have become so fractured that whatever you believe, you will find somebody else that believes it, and then suddenly you become sort of part of that tribe. I see it quite a lot. I see the rise of conspiracy theories in all areas of science. Basically, every area of science, there is an associate conspiracy theory. So I write about space travel, and I work with astronauts. We didn't go to the moon. If you're a physicist, there's people who believe there are limitless energy, whatever it is. If you an archaeologist, and there's people like Graham Hancock who believe alien built the pyramid. So there's always a corresponding
I don't think Graham
alternative
Hancock
route.
does actually believe aliens built the pyramid, because that's what
No,
I
I'm sure.
and
I,
I
I'm probably being disingenuous to Graham Hancock. I apologize.
I
I
can
meant
jump in real
I
quick
meant
and,
to desert.
clarify,
I meant to
but
desert.
initially, real quick, he did originally, like, if you look at some of his books that he published way back in the 90s, his first
Right.
initial theory was that Martians built the pyramids. And
I
then
was
he
thinking of.
makes the sort of connection between Martians and things. He has softened on it now
Right.
in recent publications to say that it's this kind of perennial lost civilization somewhere.
It
Um,
was Eric von Daniken I was thinking of, not Graham Hancock, just to be
that's
clear. I think it
also,
was Eric
okay.
von Daniken who had the ancient astronaut, or whatever. So I get confused. So my apologies to Graham Hancock, who I also don't hold in particularly high regard, but I'm sure he's a nice chap.
he has mellowed in
I
recent years, I think.
read a couple of his books actually, and they were
You're
interesting.
friends with Graham Hancock, aren't you, Carl?
Yeah, I love Graham, absolute legend, and he does get a lot of flack, but he is a journalist rather than an archaeologist, and
Good for him. Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. Good for him, and people should be able to. If people have got opinions and got ideas, they should absolutely be allowed to voice them. But they should also, appreciate that other people may want to challenge those ideas. I think he does. I've seen him being interviewed, and he's always very graceful. I think certainly the interviews I've seen him being interviewed by physicists and all kinds of people, and they've always been rather fun interviews. Certainly the ones I've seen.
They did put the kibosh on the Chariots of the Gods theme park that Eric von Daniken Blackpool, though, unfortunately.
I'd be happy at that. I would like to see
I would love to go to
an
that.
Eric von
I
Daniken.
also have met a lot of Egyptologists that got
Yeah,
into Egyptology because they read Eric Daniken and they loved Graham Hancock. And then only after they'd studied it for a period of
yeah.
time, they think, oh, maybe it's not that.
Can I just jump in? Me too. And when I was younger, I was really into the idea of UFOs and Graham Hancock and all that kind of stuff. But I, I've kind of revised my, partly because I've worked I've spent a lot of time in Egypt, and I've worked with Egyptologists. I've made programs about Egypt. I know how the pyramids were built. My own personal knowledge has sort of moved on from there. Uh,
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Like, you mentioned why the attitude towards science has changed, and I think a big part of it seems to be that we aren't having to do our own little scientific experiments like we did in more kind of agricultural societies, where we just know about how plants and animals and all these interact. We can't read the stars as an almanac anymore, generally speaking, which we used to know about, and we used to be able to set our calendar by the rising of certain planets and this kind of thing. So we're relying upon this secondhand information all the time rather than through experimentation.
You're exactly right. We've outsourced science to scientists, and and scientists are trained to sort of filter out their own biases. I mean, that's kind of the point of science. Science isn't about looking for right answers in the sense that it's trying to destroy their argument. They'll have a hypothesis, and the point, what you want to do as a scientist is try and whatever it is to destroy that hypothesis, and then whatever remains is likely to be right, or certainly right until new information comes along.
I suppose a lot of science now is quite political, though. So those biases for scientists still have some kind of influence, because you can find a peer-reviewed paper on pretty much everything, including aliens.
Yeah, but there's peer-reviewed papers and there's peer-reviewed papers. I mean, that's the point. There are standards in science, and I mean, aliens is kind of an interesting question, because I've sort of seen both sides of it, and I look at the current UFO things in America's people, disclosure, and I don't understand how people can buy into that, given that the standards of evidence are so low and non-existent. I haven't seen any evidence of a you see grainy black and white pictures, but that's kind of it. That's not good enough. That's not good enough in science. You would be your peer review paper, if you submitted that to Nature. Because I always say to UFO believers, like, great, if you've got evidence of a UFO or whatever it is that your hypothesis is, submit it to a proper peer review journal and put it out in the open, because that's what scientists do all day. They put their ideas out in the open, and they generally get shot down, or they get, if they're lucky, other people agree with it. But it's the whole point about science, and you're right, it is political and sometimes it doesn't work, but it is about being open. And if you've got an idea, put it out there and let other people test that idea, and the best idea wins.
Good. Thank you very much, Dallas. Gus, I thought we could perhaps come to you next, because you are someone that did work in the Amazon, and that led you to pursue a particular scientific path.
Yeah, so I lived in the Amazon for 12 years with, at first, quite a naive hippie, like, oh, I want to learn about shamanism. And then it's a bit like going to London and wanting to visit the Queen or something like that. You have this stereotype in your head, but once you actually move to London, you get to know the real London. Well, it's a bit like that in the Amazon. So a lot of the sort of ayahuasca tourism stuff is quite silly, to be honest. But then after living there for 12 years, I kind of got to know the culture a lot. And it's really interesting, because I am like the most empirical, ruthless empiricist going. Like, I'm really skeptical on the science side. If there isn't good empirical evidence for something, I will have a go at that idea. I'm very skeptical, but I am also completely believe in the spirit world and that kind of thing that I witnessed in the Amazon. So it's just part of the culture. And I look at it like science is good at explaining how a television works, like the capacitors, the electrodes, all the physical sort of material aspects of a television, but it can't explain the script of Brazil or a film, or do you know what I mean? It's a different sort of tool. And I think a lot of the reason there's so much skepticism about why people are much more less trusting in science at the moment, I think, is to do with climate change, because the first sort of fake papers were put out about climate change in the 90s by fossil fuel companies. And I think they didn't want climate change activists eating into their back line. So they put out a lot of climate change propaganda, fake papers, and they needed to undermine the public's confidence in science. So I think a lot of it's to do with that and social media. But anyway, yeah, getting back to my thing, I was living in Peru, and I was like, they've got all these medicines, not just ayahuasca, like for everything. And I was like, well, how did you find out that medicine? And they go, oh, well, we just talk to the plants. And I was like, oh, okay, well, you know. And so I guess I wanted to see if there was any kind of like scientific basis for plant intelligence. And, you know, it turns out there's quite a lot. There's also quite a lot of nonsense published. But yeah, I did my PhD in plant electrophysiology and 3D sound. I mean, I've got an audio background, so I understand signals and impedance and, you know, sort of that kind of side of things. And yeah, there is quite a lot of evidence for that, at least that plants are a lot more complex than we thought they were, you know. But I think there's a lot of anthropomorphization as well. So this idea that plants have their brain underground, which captivated me at first, actually, you know, it's kind of like putting human attributes onto the plant world, but actually it's like just as weird and complicated as we are, but it's just very different. But I just sort of think science is great at describing the material aspects of our experience, but it's not good at explaining something like a lucid dream or something like that. You know, it's just not, it's not that kind of tool, which is why I think there's a bit of a conflict, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive myself. I hope any of that made sense.
Thanks, Gus. Yeah, it does. And it brings to my mind as well this idea of how the worlds of science and religion used to be so entangled and they have separated out, but they also seem to be going back together now because we are recognizing more this kind of holistic, interconnected nature of nature. And you know, there's that famous quote about the first sip from the glass of natural sciences will make you an atheist and the last drop will, you know, take you back to God. And I think that more and more people are starting to feel that way because I've always thought of the planet as being like a living organism. And if our planet is a living organism, like a very complex living organism in space, then the whole of the cosmos has some like life or intelligence, if you like. And so the concept of God as this entity of intelligence, complex patterns and memory isn't actually so much of a massive like imaginative leap, you know, apart from any kind of like God that we have previously worshipped. But I think actually the ancient cultures could appreciate this a bit better, and they just created iconography to express this in an anthropomorphic way. And we're coming around, I think, to returning to this idea of the earth being a living being, that we are part of this living complex organism. And I guess the thing with science is there kind of needs to be a point. There needs to be a point in doing it. I remember I bring up this as an example all the time. You mentioned lucid dreaming. And I went to a conference run by the University of Sussex on memory and emotion. And Anil Seth, who's a very well-respected professor of neuroscience at the University of Sussex, and he runs the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science, I asked him what he thought about dreaming in relationship to memory and emotion, because dreaming is all about memory and emotion. It's very sort of well established that it's all to do with memory and emotion. And he said he didn't know anything about dreams. They haven't done any studies on dreams. And so I asked him, what are you researching at the moment then? And he told me he was doing research to find out whether rats feel regret. So if you don't have like some underlying reason for studying things, or it isn't part of this holistic framework, then I guess it's just inevitable that it's going to be a bit scattered and disjointed and confusing to a lot of people and unnecessary.
You never know what's going to come in handy though, because I mean there's all these kind of like weird research projects and you're just like, what the hell, you know, studying the mating cycle of some tiny little microbe or something, but then 30 years later that's the cure for some crazy disease, or do you know what I mean? It's like, and I think science is really slow just because it needs empirical evidence. So we can experience extraordinary things, but it may take science hundreds of years to catch up with actually being able to, you know, empirically have evidence to back those up. I think science is amazing, but I also think magic's really cool, which means I get in a lot of trouble at home because my parents are scientists and my mum's not. So yeah, it's I think you can have both. I don't think one needs to counteract the other. But religion's a bit of a it's like Christianity and all these sort of things. They're just, you know, they've tried to repress science for hundreds of years because science is like, well, yeah, the Earth's not really flat though, is it? And, you know, I think there's a big beef in that way, historical beef between science and religion, that if you so much as mention anything magical or spiritual to a lot of my scientific friends, their eyes start rolling immediately. And, you know, and I get it, it's because of the history. But what we're actually talking about is something that's completely different to standard religion, I think, you know. So
well,
yeah.
I wonder if there'll be like a new movement towards a kind of spiritual science, because I suppose like someone like Rudolf Steiner talks about that idea quite a lot. Of he has these exercises, he talks about the spiritual nature of the material world and becoming sensitive to it, and he did approach his work in his own sort of scientific way, but I just wonder whether there might be some sort of scientific movement that goes hand in hand with a more spiritual view of the world and of life. Like I look to the ancient Egyptians quite often because I think their spiritual ideas about the nature of, we talked about the placenta and how they believed the ka resided in the placenta and how they understood that the placenta is the temporary organ that supplies nutrition to the developing fetus. And actually their beliefs about the soul had this very scientific grounded material basis. So and you know, and the Egyptians were a culture that was successful for thousands of years. So it seems bizarre that we would think we need to start from scratch all the time. That's what I don't understand. It's like, why isn't there this kind of coherence and eloquence when we move from like scientific understanding or culture to culture?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me in the Amazon, like they did a study with an uncontacted tribe, which they probably shouldn't have done, and they only had like 5 illnesses because they hadn't met Europeans yet. You know, like they didn't really have that many medicines because they didn't have that many illnesses. And then a lot of the medicines that were developed in the Amazon were developed post-contact. And, you know, a lot of pharmaceutical companies have got no qualms about exploiting that knowledge and incorporating those plants, extracts from those plants into modern medicines. But you talk to the local people and they're saying, well, yeah, we just communicate with the plants. And so, you know, I mean, they've obviously got something going on, whether it's the way we understand communicating. Sadly, a lot of that culture is disappearing. You know, in the Amazon region I was in, a lot of that knowledge is lost. Most indigenous kids I know, you know, they're on TikTok and they want, you know, like it's not like... you know, a lot is getting lost at quite a fast rate. And I don't think ayahuasca tourism and sort of hippies going over there and claiming to be shamans after a few weeks is helping either, to be honest.
That seems like a very appropriate point to bring Dave in. Dave, thank you for joining us. And Dave is our resident psychedelic Indiana Jones professor of weird science. So what are your thoughts on plant communication and the kind of weirder side of science, Dave?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I've actually just given a talk at a conference in Romania this afternoon on that. I'm not in Romania though, modern technology and all that. You can do it online. But yeah, just about what's interesting for me and fun is like when gringos take ayahuasca, a lot of them actually report these experiences of transforming into other species, interspecies communication, which is completely outside of our usual everyday secular ontology and view of reality, but is totally fits in with, you know, this kind of psychedelic indigenous epistemology of like, if you want to know something, you go into an altered state and you become or communicate with that other species. And what's great is that gringos are doing this, but it's not just ayahuasca. It's like, oh, you might expect a bunch of gringos going to South America and taking ayahuasca, they're going to adopt some of that cosmology, but we see it even with people on LSD. So like 10% of people are taking LSD in our survey. I love stats. and said they'd had the experience of transforming into another species, and that is like the fundamental basis of their epistemology, according to people like Eduardo Vivero de Castro. What he calls perspectivism. It's like if you want to know something about something, you change your perspective, and knowing by becoming. And what I think is fun and exciting about that is like this could be a really brilliant way of bringing in indigenous epistemologies into modern science and, well, and science generally. In that, like, science is great for testing ideas, induction, deduction, hypothesis testing, and all the rest of it, but it's really rubbish at actually generating ideas and insights. And that's part of its problem. It's completely myopic because it kind of it comes from the premise of all the a priori beliefs that people think are science, but are actually just metaphysical positions, right? And you can go, okay, like, forget what metaphysical position you hold. If you take this as a kind of tool that you can get into an altered state and turn into another species, which gives you insights about the nature of these relationships, which you can then go away and test through all the usual boring scientific methods, and find out if they're true or not, then you've got like a much more holistic and better grounded and rounded kind of science, which is both hyper subjective, using this psychedelic perspectivism, and approaching objectivity through the scientific method. And currently, like, this kind of scientific method has completely objectified everything and everyone, nature, people, emotions, consciousness, everything, and denigrates it as this kind of atomized other, which isn't actually somehow like given any kind of respect. There's no relationality, and everything becomes exploitable, and everything is therefore able to be extracted, and that's what's got us in this fucking huge ecological mess and political mess and everything else mess in the first place, right? So I think there's an opportunity here for, like, let's have a bigger, more grown-up kind of science with different epistemologies which serve different purposes. And I think we might actually just save ourselves all from complete species annihilation. That's my ideas anyway.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, that makes me think about this idea of like the ethics of science, because without a foundation in ethics of some sort, and like you say, our ethics or ethics of the West differ to various other communities' ethics. So a lot of the issue is kind of political, like you said, social and language based, because there are certain types of culture and certain languages that have risen to the top, and therefore we're seeing a lot of science through the lens of the dominant cultures or the dominant languages. And I think about this, if you look at something like AI as well, the people feeding information and data into AI are a particular kind of people of a particular age, of a particular type of culture, and therefore the information that is being generated is all coming through that kind of perspective. There was a woman I met who was working on AI that was being fed with like information equally from all over the world, from like indigenous communities and all kinds of different places. So it was generating different information. But I think science has become like really political and really corporate. And you work a lot in psychedelics and how psychedelics are applied to therapy. And there is this risk, I suppose, of the corporatization of psychedelics now, it being rolled out into like medicine and commodified, and seems as well that in that process of you extracting the spiritual or the divine nature that a lot of people historically have experienced while taking psychedelic substances. What do you think about the commodification and the application of psychedelics in these kind of clinical, ordinary settings?
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing, isn't it? And there's like billions of dollars of investment going into this to kind of make them just like any other medicine as well, and it's like in the kind of speed of which they want to move to get these things medically licensed. They want to basically, first of all, just strip back any of the kind of psychological support often. So even like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is kind of getting stripped down to psychedelic like maintenance drug or drug use with, maybe a bit of psychological support. But even that is a kind of zillion miles away from the traditional indigenous uses of it, in that even psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is a totally westernized model. And even that's getting stripped back down to the kind of basic drugs that can be marketed. Whereas, you go to an indigenous shaman saying, you say, I'm feeling a bit, well, you go to a medical doctor and you say, I'm feeling a bit off. They ask you a bunch of questions and then they prescribe you some drugs to take, right? And that's the kind of model like the pharmaceutical companies want. Whereas if you go to an indigenous shaman, you say, I'm feeling a bit off, it's like they take the drugs and tell you what's wrong with you, right? It's like a completely different model, right? We're kind of like very far apart. And yet the middle ground might be psychedelic assisted therapy, but even that, the pharmaceutical companies in a bid to fast track them want to do away with the psychological element altogether. And we're also seeing the development of, which is really interesting, non-psychedelic psychedelics. So like kind of based on the chemistry of the psychedelic drugs, making drugs which have all the same benefits, but don't make you trip, which sounds a bit weird to me.
Thank you, Dave. So as usual, if you want to chip in at any point, just stick your hand up. I thought, Carl, this might be a good place to bring you into the conversation because you have some research that overlaps with Dave and then kind of goes into the technological side as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I'm in Egypt right now, so I don't know how good my signal is. But yeah, really great to see Dave and everyone here, Gus as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm more of a cognitive scientist, and I always say I've been a head on a stick for the first half of my life, and now I'd really love to make that journey from the head to the heart and be much more embodied. And I think that's the critical thing. And if we look at people like Chris Timmerman, I think his work's super interesting in the psychedelic space because he is really raising up the importance of the subjective experience and embodiment. And if we think about the history from Gnosticism through transhumanism to modern science, it kind of treats the body as a source of error. And a lot of my work in hyperhumanism is really about treating the body as an instrument of knowing. So I think it's really important to understand that we are like these perception boxes, and so much of what we're doing. I'm actually off to the States next week to work with Don Hoffman and launching the Trace Institute, and Andrew Gallimore and him are like so New Nautics and Don Hoffman are basically exploring this question of the importance of the context, really. So Dallas already mentioned the importance of context, and one of my contributions, or one of my ologies, if you like, is contextology, the science of context engineering. And I think before we ask what is being observed, we need to ask what kind of observer is being produced by the context. And that's why the indigenous question is so important. In other words, what the conditions of observation shape what can be known. So I think if we're gonna do citizen science, we need citizen perception. And I think it's all about training, perception, attention, interpretation. And of course, AI is having a huge effect on our sense of reality and our sense of truth. It certainly, it does feel like we're in a post-truth era. Like I know that, for instance, a lot of people are complaining that nature documentaries have been completely ruined because everyone's not even bothering to look at what they're seeing. They're just asking if it's real or not. So I think, what a lot of my work is really putting a lot of this into practice. So Gus already mentioned the amount of pseudoscience when it comes to plant signaling out there. And I'm really interested in the science of sound. And this is why I started the Museum of Consciousness, because I think that sound is so immediate in its subjective effects. But also there's so much pseudoscience in the space. I mean, this idea of this frequency will cure your ADHD, or this frequency will, create some sort of love potion. But actually, there are certain science facts like that. Certain frequencies do kill cancer cells. So I'm really exploring how do we separate the pseudoscience from the science when it comes to sound, because I just think sound is so vital and so immediate as an art form. So yeah, for me, it's all about embodiment. And I think one of the big things about AI is that it's all we'll have left is our subjective experience. And I think that the future is analog. And I think that, that's a really exciting future.
Thank you, Carl. Danny, you've got your hand up.
Hello. I'm going to try and put it down again now. I don't know how to do that. Oh yeah, I've done it. Okay, cool. Yeah, that research you mentioned, Dave, the non-psychedelic psychedelics, that's DARPA funded. That's funded by the military. And I think when we're looking at science, and I'm specifically thinking about a lot of what Dallas said there, this idea that it kind of sits aside as some metaphysic or some meta perspective, which is outside of all of the concerns of funding and politics, I think is deluded. And if we look at, let's say, looking at the history of psychiatry, for example, right, you've got diseases for slaves that were running away, given Latin names. You've got diseases for lazy blacks. That one was called dysesthesia Ethiopica. That's the 1850s. You've got hysteria, which was only dropped from the DSM in 1980. You've got masturbatory insanity. You've got eugenic feeble-mindedness in the 1900s in the US, which was an open door to eugenics and, sterilizing people. And like homosexuality, right? In the first DSM, 1952, switched to sexual orientation disturbance in 1973, renamed ego dystonic homosexuality in 1980. Fully removed in 1987. So at what point do we say, okay, yeah, we've worked it out now, and what we were doing before was kind of barbaric and wrong in science, but now we worked it out. Okay, was it? So 1987, that wasn't very long ago. And then look at ADHD today. Someone's brought up ADHD. PTSD be another one. It's a disorder now to feel bad about killing people. Because it's been scientifically classified. It used to be called shell shock, which was different. Anyway, ADHD, right? If you look at the research there, the industry-funded research is 4 times likelier to get positive results out of ADHD research. There are 0 trials, literally none. And this is a $25 billion industry on what happens after 4 weeks of taking Ritalin, right? Absolutely none. What is that, right? That's we're meant to kind of learn something about the world, but we're not. But our aperture is so low and so tiny because we don't really care to hear what does happen after 4 weeks of taking Ritalin. Well, one of the things we do know is that every year that people are on it, their growth reduces by 1 inch, right? Attacking your bones. You've got like a link to Parkinson's as well. Like ADHD diagnosis makes you more likely to get a Parkinson's diagnosis. And they're going, why is that? If you look at rat studies on giving them Ritalin, you get brain damage, right? But there hasn't been that connection made. There's really, really good traditional medicine for what people call ADHD. I take some of it myself, and I'm very happy with it. And it's neuroprotective. Solastris paniculatus would be one, Jyotismat. There's other Ayurvedic medicine which is neuroprotective rather than neurodestructive, like that kind of stuff. But I'm not seeing any very much critical thinking about ADHD. I'm seeing like polypharmacy's tripled in the last 20 years. Absolutely no research about that at all, i.e. giving people Ritalin and something else and something else. I could go on, I've studied this quite deeply. Priapism, hypersexualism, school shootings, all of those kind of things. And you call me conspiracy theorist. This is like data. But so that's kind of part of it. It's this idea that, science isn't perfect, but it's the best thing we've got. Really? Like, firstly, are you looking at how bad it is, the way it's being protracted? And then secondly, when you're saying that, like you're looking at, let's say you go back 3,000 years looking at Egyptian medicine, right? And you've got the mix of frankincense and myrrh. Sorry, not 3,000, 6,000 years, right? And this is taken from the Bedouin shamans who knew that mixing frankincense and myrrh overnight and then drinking it in the morning massively increased the cancer, the effects it had on cancer, right? You can do that study. You can do those studies today. You see that certain components are reduced, certain components are created in the mixture. the synergetic science of the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Israelites, the Persians. We got Shauheen over here. I'm sure he'll have something to say, but they knew that cinnamon was what they called a carrier medicine in Persian medicine, right? Because it helped stuff get to your liver. We would just the amount of understanding that we've got of, for example, enzyme inhibition, which came we use that in medication for SSRIs, basically selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's the first example of a Western medicine which uses enzyme inhibition, discovered by mistake from some diabetes medicine, I think in the 1950s or 60s, something like that. And you have indigenous groups using that at least 1,000, like doing enzyme inhibition with ayahuasca at least thousands of years ago. You had the mendesium, which was made by Egyptians in the Middle Bronze Age, which was mixing myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia, which works through enzyme inhibition, right? So I think that, you know, so partly I would just encourage people to think about how bad science. See, this idea like there's a mistrust of science because there's more media and because it's no, there's a mistrust of science because it's failed to do a whole load of stuff, right? Including you know, what have you got? Like 1 in 4 kids has now got a psychiatric diagnosis, or what? I forget the actual numbers. You know, it's a catastrophic failure in many ways to do what it's supposed to do what it says on the tin, right? No, I lived in the Amazon, like Gus. I went there and I got leishmaniasis, and everyone around me told me that I had to take antimonium tartrate injections. I was busy writing a book on the history of medicine, history of magic, colonial medicine, that kind of stuff. And I said, well, actually, I don't really want to do that. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to drink a dose of ayahuasca. So I did, and just to understand, so people understand, I agree with Gus a lot about what he says about rocking up in the Amazon and thinking you're a shaman. This is not, this is, you know, I'd been in lineage for 7 years at that point. The ayahuasca gave me very clear instructions, and I followed them. And then I drank every day for 5 months. And this disease, which everyone around me, including in the jungle where they're losing track of the power of their own medicines, they all thought I was crazy. I emerged with the best information I ever. It was the pivotal experience in my life, and a real insight into how ayahuasca works and the local medicine of that place. Now, there was not one person who thought that was a good idea, coming from a scientific perspective. Like that was except for even my curandero, the guy who was helping out with the cure. He advised me not to. And I said, well, I heard that your father was a great curandero. He would be able to do it. And so he took the bait and he treated me. I guess finally, like you're always looking from a metaphysics, right? This idea that science is outside of philosophy is a complete it's completely wrong, right? And I'm going to give you one final example, right? I'm a palmist. That's my day job. And when I'm explaining how palmistry works, I will often be talking about endocrine function. I'll be talking about how your ligaments are laid down, how your facts are laid down, how your bones are influenced by pituitary gland, what that does on the way you think, all that kind of stuff, all very integrated. I can explain palmistry, you know, the Vedic stuff using a scientific lens. And then I get my tarot cards out, right? Now, what I would like to say to people when they're going, well, what's this? Like, the idea that you roll a dice and it's going to be 1 in 6, you've got 1 in 6 chance of it getting something. The Egyptians weren't stupid enough to think that. The Greeks weren't stupid enough to think that. Nor were the Arabs, nor were the Indians, nor was anyone who was really good at maths back in the day, right? That's a metaphysics. That's not physics. That's a metaphysics. No one sat there and rolled a dice 10 million times and see how many times you get a 6. And when you do have long-term studies, the McDonald Douglas stuff at Duke would be one. I'm sure Dave can comment on that. The research on basically telekinesis. When you do tests for like how long was it? 10 years, 20 years? Actually, you do find that your mind can influence probabilities in random processes. Yeah, so you don't get the idea of chance being chance, not having a god in the dice basically until what is it, 1500s, like Pascal. You have to be pretty late in the game, right? That's not a metaphysics that I can explain, because the scientific perspective is so wrapped up in its own correctness that it can't admit such a thing as wild as maybe there are gods in the cards or the dice or the coin or the pendulum when you flip it, right?
Thanks, Danny. Gus, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've got to come in here. Okay, so I relate so much to what you just said. I also have been diagnosed ADHD. I don't have ADHD when I live in the Amazon. It just doesn't exist. I don't have any of the symptoms. So I'm a big proponent of the social model of mental health in this case, which is it's caused by our insanely bureaucratic society, which just doesn't, no one's on time in the Amazon. You're not running out, and where are my keys? You know what I mean? Anyway, aside from that, I also got leishmaniasis, and I feel I have to come out for science here because I feel like it's getting a bit of a battering, quite unfairly, because we wouldn't even be speaking to each other on these devices if it wasn't for science. So obviously a lot of it does work. I totally agree with you with the DSM, and a lot of actual scientists have criticised the DSM as pure pseudoscience. So on the other hand, sometimes psychiatry can help some people. But I also had leishmaniasis, and I came home back to the UK, and yeah, there's that injection one. That it's kind of like a little parasite that creates an open sore. It's like starts eating your body. It's horrific. It's really bad. And I got that on my leg. It was getting bigger and bigger. I went to the tropical medicine place in London. I said, look, I've got leishmaniasis. And they were like, no, that's impossible. They sent it off for a test, and they were like, yeah, you've got leishmaniasis. You don't have to have the horrible injection medication. There's this brand new medication. It costs £3,000. Don't lose it. I went home on the train and promptly lost it. And I was just like, oh my God, this flesh eating thing is just like consuming my leg. What am I going to do? And what I did is I went on Google Scholar and I looked up every single scientific study on different plants that had been known to have a killing effect on this parasite. And I think it was what's that stuff, aloe vera, the yellow bit that you're not normally meant to have. I kind of got that and a load of other stuff I'd read in all these papers, smeared it all over my leg. The next day my leg had gone bright red. There was these like horrific like sort of like rivulets of black and red spreading towards my heart. I was like, oh my God, what have I done? The next day, completely gone. So that is the advantage of science. Science is great. Like, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's brought us lots of cool stuff. There's just a lot of stuff that it can't explain at the moment and isn't going to explain for a very long time. It's a tool. You know, like if you're trying to get your bread knife to like construct a bathroom for you, it's not going to work. Do you know what I mean? It's a tool with very specific uses. That's what I'd say. And trying to get it to its, I think it's reductionism that's the problem, trying to get it to explain every facet of our lives and everything can be reduced to molecules and atoms. You know, that doesn't work. Newtonian mechanics cannot explain everything. And I'm not even going to start talking about quantum mechanics because I don't even have calculus level maths. The other thing I wanted to say, though, before I stop talking, is when we're talking about indigenous knowledge, I think it's really important that indigenous people represent their own knowledge, and it's not just a bunch of like Westerners talking about their knowledge for them. I think that's like super important. Otherwise, it just becomes another form of colonization. So yeah, that's my last little woke thought there.
I'm going to respond to one thing there, Gus. Thank you. Yeah, most of the indigenous people I know don't speak English, and if I'm speaking on behalf of them, then it's often in forums where they're excluded. I've been excluded from some forums now for speaking on behalf of indigenous knowledge. I wanted to say about the devices. We wouldn't be speaking on our devices if it wasn't for science. Well, I don't know about that. You're talking about tech. And if you're looking at, let's say, Tesla, who did most of the work to do, to start off telecommunications, he didn't do any science. That guy used to lie down on his couch, go on journeys until he saw a machine. He saw like one of the AC motor, which is probably powering quite a lot of this. He saw that when he was crossing Budapest Central Park reciting Goethe. He went back to his lab. He didn't make a single diagram or measure anything. He just built it. The same for his 700 patents, including the AND gate, which is running the computer. Boolean algebra, which is running the Google search, which was Bull walking along contemplating mysticism. These are not people tapping away on computers. This is not peer reviewed element of science. This is inspiration. And it comes to musicians and it comes to inventors. And I'm not even sure where science comes into that. I think we might be.
But there's a lot. Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about Tesla's background. Obviously, he's amazing, but like, obviously, there are a lot of inventions that are tech, that are based on science that was empirically, shown. I mean, there's lots and lots of examples of that. So I think just to say science is completely useless is almost as extreme as saying, magic doesn't exist. It's one extreme to the other. And I think there has to be a kind of middle road, because there's a lot of people talk a lot of crap as well. Do you know what I mean? Somebody gave me a glass of their own urine the other day at a party because they were convinced their urine had stem cells that was going to kill, there's a lot of people that will believe any old crap, and I think science is quite important as well. Sometimes to rein people in a little bit. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Well, I mean, a final thing I'm going to say here: when you're trying to set up a dialogue between, let's say, a perspective that calls something a hallucination and a perspective which calls something a vision. Hallucination has a technical meaning. It means seeing something which doesn't exist. So we're going to set up a conversation between, let's say, the indigenous world and the scientific. It's already coming from a perspective that thing doesn't exist.
I agree with you.
So finding that middle ground is actually a whole lot more complex than saying that involves some humility on the part of the scientists, I would say, and I'm not seeing it.
I totally agree with you there. I mean, like, just living in Peru for 12 years, like half my adult life, I've lived in the Amazon. I know that world is real, so to speak, in it. You know what I mean? It's like, and I know science, it wouldn't even know what to measure. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not. So I just think they're two completely different worlds. But when it comes to science, I like things to be, I want evidence. So if it's science, do the science properly. If it's other stuff that science can't even comprehend, it's like, I do think it's like the telly. The science can describe the capacitors in a television. It can't explain the script of a movie that moves your soul or something. Like, it's just it's not that tool. It's a certain tool for doing certain things. It's not meant to describe the spiritual and magical experiences of human beings. It just doesn't do that, and it never will.
I think, what Danny's talking about, and it's something that I think is very true, is this science is subject to corruption, like so many other things, and scientists can be corrupted. They can be coerced by companies to get them to prove things that they want to be proven. It's not like it's not infallible, like we said at the beginning. It's like, I think that people are starting to not trust themselves, not know their own natural environment, not know what plants or fruits or how to grow anything. And when you have a population that don't know how to thrive in the natural world, then they are going to have to take their information from people that are better educated on that front. And there is this opportunity for mistrust. They don't know, like, they can't, like Dave was talking about, sort of veracity checking. They don't know where to begin with the veracity checking because they don't understand it. You ask the average person how their mobile phone works, they've got no idea. So, like, we don't know how the tools that we use every day work, and I think that's a big part of it.
It's like that book, The Machine Stops. I don't know if you've ever read that, where, like, humanity's looked after by this massive machine, but no engineers exist anymore, and then it stops and everyone dies. Great book. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, because I did, before I did my PhD and I did a lot of techie stuff, I didn't really meet a lot of scientists. And now I've met a lot of scientists. They're the biggest nerds on the planet. They've all got green hair. They take bucket loads of psychedelics, a lot of them. They're really autistic, really ADHD. They're complete nerds. They're not like white-coated corporate robots that are out to screw humanity. Do you know what I mean? Most of them really care about, they want to make a difference in the world as well and make it a better place. But I think, they've got a bit of bad PR. I mean, obviously there is like corporate stuff as well. And I definitely agree with, about the DSM. It's just a bit of a joke, really. But yeah.
I met someone, I think he was at Oxford, ethnopharmacologist, or he was studying the ethics of pharmaceutical research, and told me about how, like Danny mentioned, diseases are invented because they'll test a substance to see what it does and then invent a disease to kind of make that drug valuable. So things like that do happen. I mean, there's no about that, and it's all advertising. You think about people being told that smoking was good for them, and we're still there. Really, we're still now there at that, being told smoking is good for us with processed food or whatever else. Advertising is fantastically powerful and has affected all of us.
Yeah, most scientists I've met have been pretty sound, I'll be honest. Like, there haven't been...
I'm not surprised that you've met good scientists, but there's definitely some evil ones, right?
There's got to be some evil ones, hasn't there? I mean, the weapons ones. And I think pharmaceutical industry, you know, sometimes, especially psychiatry, I'd be quite skeptical of a lot of that. But sometimes it does help people as well. I don't know. I'll shut up for a bit anyway.
Siri, you're next.
Yeah, hi everyone. So much great stuff has been said already, but I like to sort of take a little step back and think about what the average person can kind of make of all this stuff, right? I'm not a scientist per se. I work in the humanities and I have a research background in the humanities. And one of the things that I've been very, very concerned about and very interested in for a very long time is the problems of interdisciplinarity and true interdisciplinarity and the importance of it. So I have a kind of a penchant for, I like the polymathic Renaissance people. And the reason I like the polymathic Renaissance people is because they can check knowledge through across various forms of domain. So science and the scientific inquiry is one model for doing that. But there are lots of other models for inquiring after truth. Now, the way that we educate people today, right, is that we have this very sort of separated idea about you're now in this class and we're doing this subject, and now we're moving to this class and we're doing that subject. And we don't have this kind of holistic understanding or underlying pattern making that people need. So when Carl says stuff like, I think the future is analog, I believe that. And the reason I believe that is because the kind of knowledge that you can acquire through your hands, for example, is a completely different kind of knowledge, but it does actually provide you quite a lot of cognitive understanding of things. So that's one domain where everyone can gain knowledge about how to do something through actually doing it physically, right? The kind of idea of muscle memory and understanding your, understanding how something works through interacting with it. Thinking about it is another way, like you can examine something logically. I also think we need to slightly revise our models of logic in the West. So there is a difference between the kind of typical Aristotelian Western logic, which actually does not take context into account, while Chinese logic, which is very similar to that, actually does take context into account, which means that the minute you move into a different situation, the outcome of an argument has to be slightly different because context actually matters for how you act. So there are some kind of like underlying patterns and assumptions that we can start looking at. And I think one of the ways in which systems of magic, for example, can help inform that is that it has a way of creating kinds of frameworks where you can check across domains if something overlaps, right? If there's a kind of pattern making that makes sense, right? So you can compare, for example, Tarot and Kabbalah, all of these systems map onto each other and help you kind of explore that. And I think that's one of the appeals of that type of inquiry. And of course, another domain for knowledge is, as many people here have pointed out, is the imagination. You can't really say that the imagination is scientific, but it is important. And if we generated an educational system that allowed for these overlaps to happen, then the individual human being would be better at understanding or resonating with truth when they encounter it, right? The skepticism that you see, this kind of unhealthy, skepticism can be healthy, but it can also be unhealthy, right? When you become so skeptical that you just buy whatever is being said by the person that you like the most. I think that what Dallas was saying about the people we trust are the people that give us our ideas. It's a very important thing to remember. Now we have all these influences all over the place, right? And people build relationships with them or have an invested sense of that particular person, and therefore more likely to believe what they're saying. But if they had this underlying more real interdisciplinary approach, you wouldn't be so easily duped, I think. So I think it has a lot to do with this problem in education, which I hope we can start addressing. And I think we are addressing it. I think there is a paradigm shift coming, and I certainly hope so. But those are my 2 cents for the moment.
Thank you very much, Siri. Dave.
Yeah, thanks for that, Siri. I wasn't not sure what I was going to say, but just like, yeah, that sense of like instilling critical thinking, I think, is what's really vital. And I think science, when it's good, does do that. But it is kind of blindsided by its kind of prior beliefs, vociferous skeptics, cynicism, funding, all of that bad stuff. But yeah, it can help develop critical thinking, and that's kind of like what we really need, particularly in this kind of internet age, right? And I'm not going to kind of toss out science completely. I think I think there's different things, isn't there? There's the kind of sociology of science and how it functions and operates in the real world in terms of scientists getting co-opted and bought by corporations or governments or kind of political agendas. I've just been reading stuff today about this organization which is that Farage is involved in and being funded by, and they have this kind of secret location in London where they're promulgating eugenics and kind of like really old hat intelligence science, the kind that Danny was talking about, which all got thrown out the window like a few decades ago, showing that black people are inherently less intelligent than white people and so on. And it was science that ultimately gave that corrective to that. Yes, there were a whole bunch of psychologists and researchers in history which became motivated politically to kind of come up with kind of certain facts in science, but then like movements like the American Psychological Association ultimately decades later, however, I have to say, did then kind of make a corrective on that. So science isn't static, but it does have this self-corrective process involved in it, right? So Danny was talking about, he's basically kind of dissing science by quoting loads of science. He was talking about ancient science, and then he's talking about all this stuff about ADHD and the drugs. But then if you look at the other science, it says actually that's all really bad science. Then so you're using science, and that is it. There is no one static science. It's a kind of negotiation and this agreement through some kind of moving towards a point of consensus that never actually arises. But that truth is not a static factor, and that we kind of like science at its best is a tool that people use collectively, right? But the whole system is fucked because we have this kind of corrupt peer review system. We have like proprietary funding for all kinds of things. I've like tried to make my entire career, I'm now a professor, I don't know how, by not taking corporate dollar, right? I've basically become a pauper of an academic, but I've managed to keep my scientific integrity by only studying the things I'm interested in and doing the science in an impartial way, like as impartial as it can be, right? I have my own agendas, but not buying into the mainstream belief system that scientists think they ought to have. But that's fucking rare. It's like really hard to do that and still have a career. And so scientists often compromise whatever positions they have to maintain jobs. So the system is completely screwed. But I think as a method, it's a good system for like corroborating different views collectively based on data, which is never perfect, to kind of try and move in a direction of, okay, what can we agree more on than not, right? And like science is ancient, and indigenous people have their science. There's a very different, it's a different basis of science, but it's through a system of observation, trial and error, interrogation. That is a system of science. A lot of it's coming intuitively or directly or communicating with spirits or whatever, but it's still like a suck it and see that, okay, let's not do that again. because you might end up getting possessed or whatever. But like, it's a system of trial and error. It has its own system of checks and balances and is scientific in its own way, just not in a kind of formalized kind of the Western ritualized way. It's got its own ritual to it. Anyway, I just had a bit of a massive rant there. So there was one point I want to pick up on what Danny was saying about psychokinesis, which I think is kind of fun because as a parapsychologist, I've been exploring this area for a while as well, and like the idea that all science is basically based on probability. Like there are no facts in science. There is no certainty. Everything's based on probability, and theories are never settled ultimately. Okay, and they're just models. So there is no ultimate reality that scientists can hold up and say, well, this is ultimate reality. We're pretty sure about that. And if they do, they're full of shit, right? But all of it's based on this kind of probabilistic notion. So even like the Higgs boson, right? This kind of fundamental particle. They build this massive particle accelerator, vast, and spend billions and billions of dollars and testing it. And ultimately, they come up with an answer which has a 5 sigma kind of certainty, if you like. That is one in about like several million to one that this is a real genuine phenomenon, that this Higgs boson exists. Meanwhile, Roger Nelson and a bunch of parapsychologists set up these kind of various random number generators all around the globe, and they leave them running for a couple of decades, and they collect data and make predictions about at certain kind of global events where there's a lot of kind of consciousness coherence. These random number generators will deviate statistically from chance in an inexplicable way, and they ended up over the course of 20 years with a 6 sigma in probabilistic finding. Right, when you pull all that data, that is less than 1 in billions, 1 against several billion to chance that they found this thing. And if you hold the two things up together, they look inseparable. Like the search for the Higgs boson to parapsychologists looks like a massive psychokinesis experiment involving a huge kind of ritual in creating this massive, ginormous magic circle with all the focused intention of hundreds, thousands of physicists to find this kind of esoteric element, which then they base its existence purely on this kind of improbable statistical finding, which is basically what parapsychologists are doing with global consciousness. So it's like, science is more art than science, according to Rick from Rick and Morty, and I happen to agree.
Thanks, Dave. Chris.
There you go. Well, my microphone is there. Yeah, it's interesting. I completely agree. And Siri and David, you both made excellent points. I think one thing that I think I would add is really sort of David building up something you said. It's really important to not treat science as this sort of monolithic entity that there is just sort of one way of doing it, right? Because I don't think anyone would sort of compare methodologies or whatever it is between historical sciences, social sciences, and hard sciences, right? They're all considered sciences, but they have completely different methodologies. They have different categories of data. They have different hierarchies of evidence, all that kind of thing. And when you look at disciplinary histories and philosophy of science and paradigmic models, all that kind of thing, all the conceptual sciences, whether it's hard sciences or social sciences, whatever it is, we kind of have this perception that science just kind of pops out of the mind of Zeus like Athena fully formed, and that we all kind of know exactly what's going on. But when you look at it historically, sciences develop their own ontological and epistemological models, and they usually define for themselves what constitutes a valid explanation for whatever data they're looking at. So ideally, what we've settled on in sort of mainly Europe and America, and there's post-colonial critiques about how valid that can be if you're generalizing. I happen to agree with David. I think perspectivism is probably like the next genuine big step. That's with my own personal belief on it. But ideally, where we're at currently, when we talk about science as an epistemology, that's ultimately what it is. It also isn't ontologically self-grounding. There are a bunch of metaphysical issues that we can also get into at maybe another point down the road. What we're talking about as a process is a pursuit of knowledge, right? It's a way that we approach mainly systematizing knowledge. And it's something that for us now is largely empirically driven, systematic. Like I said, it's supposed to be self-critical. Yeah, definitely. And as part of that, it's supposed to be self-correcting and cumulative. So you sort of build up from what you know. Problem-oriented as well. Right? So we have this sort of idea that there is a problem that we are ultimately trying to solve. And that also requires different hierarchies of evidence and whatever else. If you're looking at sort of, big major figures in philosophy of science, so I'm thinking, people like Thomas Kuhn and Feyerabend and all these kind of people who talk about paradigmistic science. When you're looking at sort of disciplinary history, especially, it kind of renders any kind of disciplinary position of science basically a moot point. It's kind of, at least when you're talking about identities of science, right? Just because you are a scientist today or whatever field you are particularly in, it's completely different to what was considered valid as an explanation or as a science 100 years ago, or even just 50 years ago, really. So what we're really talking about, I think, is when we look at science, is grounding a sort of shared methodology and epistemic basis of how we approach certain kinds of data, certain kinds of knowledge. And that opens up a wider problem, I think, where if your data that you're looking at, even if you're studying experiences, psychology, whatever it might be, if we take the example of psychedelics, which is coming up a lot, right? If you are trying to study that phenomena as a scientist, or at least studying it scientifically, it is impossible for you to get any data outside of your own subjective experience, right? You have to go and be a psychonaut, effectively, right? You have to take whatever the substance is, you have to observe the data, but then you're bringing that information back down to a sober level of awareness, right? You're bringing it out of that state of consciousness into something else, and you can't really approach your data in that way and create kind of valid epistemological model. You need a kind of like radical empiricism to study this kind of stuff, right? And I mean fully radical, right? Because you're studying it through your own senses and your own abilities. So it becomes more about how you are approaching your data and then how you are systematizing the data, especially, right? So it's a process and a method, effectively, that we are talking about, where we think when we're systematizing this knowledge, all the kind of propositions you're making, you're thinking about, is it falsifiable? Is a big one. So very simple question. It's a very simple way of looking at it. It's like, how would you know you were wrong? Is the basic way of asking yourself it, right? So if you divide any kind of model or a hypothesis or an idea, you just ask yourself through that kind of way of thinking. And that's how you do your claim evaluation, all that sort of stuff. I think there is generally a good kind of dialectic between generalizing and particularizing models. There needs to be a conversation there, because sometimes, I come from an archaeology and history background, and we are often we get accused of being sort of a very latest born sciences, right? There is a lot of debate, especially since the 60s, because in the 60s we were trying to adopt and become a hard science, effectively, which is completely the wrong model of science for archaeology. We should be a social science. That's my own opinion. But we kind of get accused of being like methodological and philosophical magpies. We're like a Frankenstein. We just pick, like, there is no such thing as an archaeological theory, or even that kind of thing. We just kind of pick tons of different things from different sciences and just kind of try and fit them together and make them work. So we kind of have a lot of these interesting discussions that end up coming up. And one of the things that I've always been interested in is people have this assumption that science is meant to explain things. It's like, well, I mean, explanation isn't necessarily the de facto goal of science. It's just kind of like a stepping stone or a means toward this accurate knowledge that we are supposed to be, having or equating, whatever it is. There is no. It's one of the problem I have with this kind of discussion sometimes is there is no sort of. This might be a bit controversial to say, actually. I might get some backlash for it. I don't think there is any kind of cross-disciplinary scientific method. Because when you look at it, when you're looking at multiple different disciplines, they all have their own models and their own standards of evidence and their own ways of understanding what counts as a valid explanation. What would count as a valid explanation for a physicist in one context is going to be completely different to what counts as a valid explanation for a historian or a social science researcher or someone in the humanities, for instance. So people like Dudley Sharp, I don't know if anyone's heard of it, he's written a lot of really good books on philosophy of science and this kind of thing. When you look at how sciences develop historically, they begin by, first of all, defining their own subject matter, which is in response to a series of phenomena that start coming up. So the most recent example would be things around consciousness, right? Whether it's things about psychedelics and these experiences that people are having, things like telekinesis, which is all kind of things. So we notice that there is a phenomena going on that we don't really know about. So the first thing you do in that process of becoming a science and evaluating knowledge scientifically is you define your subject matter, first of all. So you say, this is what I want to study, right? This is the area where something's happening that we're not really too sure, but we want to kind of investigate it. And then in response to that, you demarcate your area, right? And in that process, you then define what the means are and the methods that you're doing for studying it, right? And then as part of that, you kind of create and come up with the idea of what is considered relevant and what is the explanatory character you're actually getting at. So you're not only, we kind of have this idea of flat theory where everyone has a tendency to put any kind of theoretical proposition or any kind of answer on the same epistemological level. It's like, well, there needs to be this huge hierarchy of theory because there is different kinds of evidence. There are different kinds of theories, different kinds of explanations, that kind of thing. And we need to define for ourselves what is the explanatory character required of what we're studying, what is considered a valid explanation in terms of what our data is telling us, right? And I think really that kind of process, there is a lot of debate now whether we can speak about progress. There's a lot of philosophical post-colonial debate about whether this concept of progress, especially moral progress, has been sort of too tainted with colonial ideas to actually hold any kind of relevance. I disagree with that. I think we still can, but scientific progress, I think, depends on achieving that kind of methodological and theoretical consensus, at least as far as how you are going about acquiring, testing, and then refining whatever your knowledge is within this given domain, right? And because the problem you have, I often see, is people will tend to, like kind of like how we had this discussion earlier, I think actually, people will tend to sort of equate technology and science, and they will kind of think they're the same thing, right? And to a certain extent, there is some degree because technology relies on science and vice versa. But scientific techniques, all they're doing is getting you a great amount of data ultimately. So for my background at least, archaeology, and we're dealing with ancient societies and that kind of thing. We are now it's very popular for us to deal with ancient DNA, with all these different, very much more fancy kind of dating techniques and that kind of thing. All that is doing in principle is giving you more data to work with, right? It's not actually answering any questions that you're putting to it. It's just generating all this more masses and masses and masses of data. And all these techniques, they are great and they can give us new amounts of data and all those kind of things, but they can just as easily serve scientific or non-scientific ends. It's not anything about the actual technology in and of itself that it works that way, right? So whatever level of data you're getting, it can increase and spiral off into infinity. But if you can't approach the kind of questioning and the way you're phrasing the questions with this kind of systematization of knowledge that is falsifiable, that is all these kind of things, then it's not scientific, right? And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different modality of knowledge, right? It doesn't, like, there is a desire, like there is a problem, I think, where we have when we get into these discussions of ethics and things. There is a lot of baggage around what is generally called empiricism in Europe, and probably I think logical positivism in the US. I can't think of the exact name. If you're looking at it in sort of colonial perspectives, there was very much a tendency of saying, the way in which we do science, which is mostly descended from people like Descartes and Bacon, all those kind of things, it's responding to that crisis of reason that we're having in the 17th century. That is the way of doing science. And everything else that can't be reduced to the model of European empiricism is just not a valid form of knowledge. The problem you have with that is that the form of awareness or the form of cognition that is required to get that kind of discussion and operate on that level, at least epistemologically, of European empiricism, it's a very, very niche, very, very well-defined phase of consciousness that you're doing that in, right? It's kind of like your sober everyday consciousness. And the second that you go outside of that, you will then get critiqued by sort of the more hardline European empiricists that it's not genuine knowledge because, it's sort of the typical, oh, well, psychedelics are not, it's just visions or it's whatever else. You're not in your sober consciousness, so therefore it's not valid. There is a lot of colonial baggage in that area, right? It's a means to devalue the knowledge and other means of knowledge that have been used by indigenous cultures, absolutely. But I think going back to perspectivism, if we are going to be progressing in these paradigms of science and we're going to be investigating new areas and things, what we need is to take that kind of underlying methodological approach to what we think science is, things about falsifiability, etc., and apply that to whatever new data and whatever new areas are coming out. If we're not doing that, then it's not science. And whether we want to, add an ethical dimension into that about validity of that kind of knowledge is maybe a different discussion. But I think that's important. I think it's important to kind of just demarcate levels of things.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it's interesting. Dallas has gone now to get his train, but one thing that made me think of is the science that's involved in, say, getting people to the moon successfully. Like, that is, if that science doesn't work, then those people aren't going to get to the moon. Right. So there is science that has this, like Siri was talking about the way we teach children being like one class of this, one class of that, one class of this. And I read about the educational system in Finland that is project based, and science of getting people to the moon, it's got a purpose, a well-defined purpose, and every kind of science is involved in that particular project. And I think about, you know, the modern science of archaeology and how so many other forms of science are now incorporated into archaeology, like you mentioned, DNA and dating techniques and all this kind of stuff. So it strikes me that like those project-based science things are more effective, because if they don't work, it's not such an easy advertising job to convince people they're working when they're not, because the proof is in the pudding, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's an interesting thing you bring up, actually, because one of the I don't know, I was having this discussion with one of my professors the other day, actually. One of the things that's really interesting about archaeology is how is, especially in the past sort of 10 years or so, it's become very dehumanizing, right? And sort of you're divesting a lot of people of autonomy. And it's interesting that the way in which we do that, we are earing more and more towards very specific, highly sort of specialized scientific environments, right? And what ends up happening, ultimately, what we're doing is we're studying humans, right? We're studying past human behavior. But the way in which we do that is we are making our area of study less and less human, right? We are talking about ancient DNA, so we're scaling things all the way down to microbial levels, DNA levels, right? Or we're talking about, on the other end of it, massive geospatial data and using GIS, right? These are not human scales, but we are asking about human questions. And the more and more we kind of use scientific methods to do these things, the less and less the human becomes the center. You know, so there is this kind of divestment away from the body and the experience of the body and the experience of a person living in an ancient area. And there are various reasons for that, but it is something to be very mindful of, because there is this sense of not only like we are actively moving away from the body, and we are also actively being told that we need to move away from the body, right? Because there are all these ideas, all these conversations around identity and things. Lots of different kinds of bodies now exist, and very few of them are about the actual physical somatic body in and of itself. And we are losing touch with that. And a lot of that comes from this kind of heavy abstraction, which to a certain extent, you know, you can trace it back to Aristotelian science. I'm not the biggest fan of Aristotle in myself personally, so you know, I'm maybe not the best person to ask. But it is important to realize sort of, again, what is the nature of your questions. And you talk about project specific. I would sort of use the same idea. I'd probably just call it like question specific. You know, so it, like the kind of models and the kind of approach to knowledge that you're using depends on the kinds of questions you want answers to, and what are you actually interested in doing, and that's going to dictate what kind of methods you're using.
I think it really requires a certain amount of knowledge to know what the right questions to ask even are in the first instance as well. Yeah. It makes me think what we're talking about here of science being like a non-fiction book, and thinking about the person and the psychology or consciousness as being like a story. And I think historically people have communicated science with stories and narratives a lot. And now there seems to be more emphasis on whether things are scientifically true or not. But if you look at a lot of the ancient myths and the ancient stories and the ancient ways of operating in the world, they're story-based and they have a powerful resonance because human beings can emote more in stories. They're more likely to feel them and to feel embodied in a storytelling type of world. So I wonder if it does seem to be something that we're returning to, this idea and this understanding and appreciation for the intelligence and wisdom of a lot of ancient storytelling and conceptions around things like creation myths and things like that. We're recognizing the science that's actually encoded within those stories, and how clever that technique actually is of creating stories in terms of enabling ancient people to remember things about the planetary cycles or agrarian festivals and things like this. So
no, so I'll respond to this and then we can move on, I guess. So it's an interesting one because you're looking, like, a lot of it goes back to also the way in which we write as well, right? So we have kind of adopted, at least in the Western world, we have adopted the written word, at least in our legislative frameworks and all other things. and the way in which we write in terms of like a phonogram system where individual signs or sounds represent letters and all that kind of thing. If you look at the way in which indigenous cultures in the Americas or in the Amazon write, so I'm thinking even beginning in Hopi and then downwards in sort of southwest United States and then into Central America, and then also obviously North and South America. And they use pictographic writing. The way in which pictographic writing works and conveys knowledge is completely different to the way that a phonological writing system conveys knowledge. And the one of the ways in which it does it is it's kind of the pictures serve as sort of memory complements rather than conveying semantic meaning in the way that when we read a sentence and we read, meaning out of the signs, not everything is written down in a pictographic language because it kind of presupposes that you already know a lot of the memory stuff that's there anyway. So you read it and it acts as a kind of prompt that then gets your memory working. One of the things that happened, I remember doing a podcast interview, it's quite a few years ago now. It was with Dr. Lynn Kelly. She's done a lot with memory technologies. It's like mind palace type things. And she's worked primarily with Indigenous Australians, so Aboriginal Australians. And one of the things that absolutely blew my mind is she had this, I don't have an example near me, it's basically like a little block of wood, effectively. And it was given to her by one of the elders that she was working with. And she had pinned loads of different beads and shells and bird wings and all these kinds of things on it, right? And she held it up to me and she was explaining it to me. This is basically, this is a huge database. It's a computer, right? And it is a computer that is based on stories. So it's a mind palace type thing where she would basically run her finger along each bead or each shell, and every single one would have a story, and it encoded the entire map of Australia and the entire like walking routes that Aboriginals would take, right? And it was I'm not being, I was talking hyperbole here. It was more complex than any GIS system I've ever seen. Right, it was far more complicated than anything we can get into the satellite data, and it was entirely somatic. It was entirely based on her own memory, her own body, and the pattern in which she was moving her fingers around and how it triggered different memories. And it's just it's an entirely different kind of modality of knowledge. And when you bring in these kind of value judgments, and you say, oh well, that's not a valid system of knowledge because it's not technological. Like, well, it is a technology. It's just that the technology is not a material-based technology that we know from the West in terms of how we've expanded our own technology. But these are technologies. So I think you can describe a lot of these things, whether it's psychedelics, whether it's cognitive, imaginative journeys that people are taking, all these, or even just ritual in general. You can describe them as technologies, and they are technologies for creating different kinds of data and different kinds of experience that you then go and talk about. Because the difference is where we would go and do a massive amount of data, and then we would go and publish it in a very dry peer review journal that probably like 5 people will only ever read, and then most of them will hate you for it and disagree with you. The way that they kind of process their data is not in an official publication. They go have the experience, and then they go and either codify it into a story or a performance, or they take it back to the rest of the tribe and they sit down and they talk with it. One of the things I remember reading an ethnographic article about sort of ayahuasca use in I can't remember the exact area now. It was in somewhere in South America, and it really kind of interested me because they talked about how sometimes we have this perception in the West that when white people do ayahuasca tourism, it's exclusively for ritual. That Amazonian cultures only use ayahuasca for ritual contexts, and one of the things that this paper was talking about was how members of this tribe will quite happily use it for even just everyday purposes. Like they'll use like a telephone, right? They'll be like, oh well, I'm on the other side of the jungle. I'm going to take ayahuasca, go and talk to you in my dream, and we're like 2,000 miles away or 1,000 miles away, and we'll come back and we'll have a conversation about it. And it's used in a completely different manner to how we think about it in like a ritual use. And it's as common to them in using it in that context as using a telephone is or a mobile phone is to us. And we elevate and sort of big up the mobile phone as this great technological invention. It's like, yeah, well, they have the same thing. They just don't use the copper and the silicon and the crystals or whatever to make the mobile phone. They do it through their own body. So it is an entirely different kind of knowledge, but I think it's just as valid. And I think we have to be very careful assigning these kind of value hierarchies to things. But it's anyway, I'm still talking now.
That's something I'm really interested in, because I think a lot of ancient intelligence comes through this kind of dialogue and conversation between the world and the individual person and the collective. And when you were talking about indigenous Australians and encoding this information into this block. It reminded me of I think he's an anthropologist, Charles Mountfield, wrote about the knowledge that a group of people he was working with in the outback had of the night sky. And he said they had a story for stars down to the 4th magnitude. And so the entire night sky was this story that they could read to one another. And it gave them incredibly useful survival information about where to find fishes at a certain time or when certain plants were to be collected. So it makes loads of sense and is an incredibly logical, scientific way of encoding information in a way that's readily accessible to the human mind, because we exist through stories and storytelling. And I think, you know, you mentioned pictographic scripts, and you look at something like Egyptian hieroglyphs, you have the same thing there, where they don't have all the vowel sounds. The signs can be arranged in various different ways for aesthetic purposes, but you are depicting real things of the world. So it's this reminder, this echo of the fact that the world is directly talking to you and you can read it. And a few of us have brought up ideas of kind of oracular thinking, and that oracular thinking for most people in ancient times was just everyday normal fact of life, that the world is revealing the future to you all the time if you could only read the signs. And the Mesopotamians called the stars the writing of heaven, because the constellations themselves are a script that can be read. And actually, if you are really familiar with the night sky, you can predict things like the inundation of the Nile. And so they do act as kind of heralds for big events on Earth. So there was something else, but I can't remember what it is. Maybe it'll come back to me later. Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. Alexi.
Yeah, just saying hi. Maybe next time I have like 5 minutes, but at this point, just saying hi.
Danny, do you want to come in next?
How do I turn this thing off again? I press that button. Yeah, okay, done it. Chris, that was brilliant. Thank you. I like to hear Fairabend in your list and in your voice. I just don't want to so there's a couple of things which I think we're conflating maybe, which is science. We've always had science. Yes, we've always had science. We've always looked at the world and we've always made laws about what means what, right? I think what my complaint is anyway is the primacy of, let's say, Baconian science or that kind of thing, that specific knowledge system, which says, you do the scientific method, you do your Novum Organum, and you create your data, and you don't listen to spirits talking to you. Right, that's not actual knowledge. So I think that's a bit of I think we need to distinguish those things so we know what we're talking about. That's the main thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is I disagree about this corrective, this idea that science has its corrective. We used to think this about black people, and then science changed. And no, that's not actually how it happened. So if you look at how racial science worked, before it was racial science, there was the curse of Ham, right? That was why black people were enslaved. And then you go all the way through into, I mean, they're still doing it now, but you've got scientists with phrenology on the shape of black people's heads. It wasn't science which overturned that racism. It was rioting by Malcolm X. You can look at the same history with the suffrage movement with women. They were still, it was the curse of Eve, right? You couldn't trust women to vote because look what she did in the Garden of Eden, right? And then you're measuring women's heads and the size of their brains and how their hysteriums work, and saying, no, she can't vote. Well, what overcame that? Rioting by Emmeline Pankhurst and her gang. You could say the same about homosexuality as well. Harvey Milk, right? That's when that story finishes. It's with rioting. So this is what I'm saying. It's not corrective. Science, the scientists who keep up with where politics is going manage to maintain their relevance. And this is really what, coming all the way back to what our friend was saying right at the beginning, why are people losing interest in science now? Because it hasn't kept up. It really hasn't. And we're in this moment, which is it feels to me like we're in the kind of Reformation, basically, where suddenly the Pope has lost his lost its authority. No one believes it anymore. So people are nailing their theses to the wall, and they're saying, I was at a watch party for an Acapulco, and there was a debate about whether the world was flat or potato shaped or some other shape, and they were all talking utter nonsense. Like, but it's all acts like pandemonium. Like everyone's theory is on the table, and you've got something similar with all of the different movements that emerged out of the Reformation, whether they were the ranters in the pub, or they were the Quakers, or they were the levelers, or they were diggers. It's all kind of out on the table, and they'll fight amongst themselves. And I don't know where we end up. So that's what I want to say. Let's not let this kind of state. Oh, and I want to say something actually. Bacon himself, who was the guy who came up with the new instrument of science, what was his? He was like a really high up authority in
Lord
English.
Chancellor.
Yeah, the Chancellor, exactly. So it was this English science, the English scientific revolution as well. It comes out of the consolidation of the British Empire, and it's exporting that model, and it's still exporting that model. There's a wonderful book by a medical anthropologist, Ethan Watters, which is called Crazy Like Us, the exportation of the American psyche. I think where he's talking about how basically models which fill the pockets of investors are being exported all over the world and annihilating indigenous and traditional perspectives all over the world. And that's what's turning, right? It doesn't work anymore. So the cracks are opening up, and people are finding their own way. The last thing I want to say, Bruno Latour wrote a book called The Pasteurization of France, and he is talking about how the idea of germ theory is taken up by. So he's the guy who invented pasteurization, like Pasteur. He's talking about how the idea gets taken up by France, and it's not because the science was convincing. It was because it was expedient for people's agendas to use that particular model of reality rather than other models of reality. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying we don't do stuff because we believe in stuff. We believe in stuff because we want to do stuff.
Yeah, no, there's a lot I agree with what you're saying. Yeah, I think the first thing is if you go back to that idea of sort of Thomas Kuhn and paradigms of science, it's this idea that there isn't a monolithic science, that science, or what is considered science, moves through different paradigms depending on what the culture is doing, right? So scientists, like anthropologists, ideally speaking, the good scientists, we should say, if you're being a good scientist, you should follow what the culture is doing. So you follow the kinds of questions the culture is generating. And in doing so, you move through different paradigms. And the scientists who don't do that end up getting left behind. At least ideally, that's how it's supposed to work. If that's actually how it works in practice, is an entirely different conversation. Because obviously, as we said, there's tons of political motivations and things behind that as well. One of the things that always interests me about Bacon, especially, so I'm thinking sort of great. Was it great? I can never remember what it's called. Or great instantiation, or whatever it is. 1620, I think it is, that he's writing. It's sort of around the same time that he's writing, the New Utopia or New Atlantis, whatever it's called. He has, I have a really weird, interesting, complicated relationship with Bacon, because on the one hand, I really love him, and I really love the things he's doing. And I happen to think that sort of Baconian strong inference as a hypothetical model, at least for doing science, is a very good way of doing science. So you sort of have a hypothesis, and then you test various things that eliminate and shrink the hypothesis down as much as you can. I think that's a very good way of doing science. On the other hand, he is largely like Descartes, who is a little bit after. He's largely very neo-Epicurean, and I really hate his ethical outlook on life and his ethical outlook on science. There is a point in Great Insaturations that he says, and he also, he sparks off the entire crisis of reason, effectively, for lack of a better term. There's a point where he says that nothing is worth being called true unless it's useful, right? So he is fundamentally a pragmatist in his philosophy and his sort of approach to life. And his approach to science and technology is largely kind of ethical hedonism, effectively, right? It's neo-Epicureanism. So it's this idea that science and what we call science, or at least his modern philosophical approach, let's call it that. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on Bacon at this point. But when he's talking about his shift to modern philosophy, because there is a lot of debate over when exactly we position the start of modern philosophy, and who exactly we sort of credit the whole thing with. And a lot of people, Hume and Kant were very big on crediting Bacon as it, but Descartes has been touted upon. Even Machiavelli has been touted for modern political philosophy. But anyway. What Bacon is doing when he's coming up with his massive critiques of Aristotle and all that kind of thing, his model of modern philosophy is characterized by a series of different things that he outlines in great instantiations. So on the one hand, he is rejecting the previous philosophical tradition as inadequate, which he largely means Aristotelian science, so sort of medieval scholasticism for the most part. And as part of doing that, he also reorients inquiry, so about the nature of knowledge and what we're supposed to be doing, from understanding nature to commanding it. And that's also then how you get Descartes, who thinks that the ultimate scientific advances are, or like the model of ultimate science, effectively, is to make us lords and dominions of nature, right? And it's interesting. It's very, very Christian as well, because it relies on this kind of linear concept of time, in a manner of speaking. So if you look at the ancient world, and when a lot of the ancient societies are doing science, they are working in a cyclical model of time. That there is no real thing as progress in the ancient world. And the ancient cultures in themselves did not really talk about progress as an institution. They talk about finding ancient knowledge and all this kind of thing and going around in cycles. It's only really with the 17th century that we get this idea of linear progress, that humanity, and with the Enlightenment, that we are moving forward in the world. We are moving up in the world. We are not, descending and getting worse and worse from our fall in the Garden of Eden. And part of that is phrased in this kind of Christian ethos of the entirety of our experience goes from Genesis to Revelations. And then when you get to the 17th century, you get to Enlightenment, and you start getting these kind of secular democracies, where they take the church out of the whole thing. That kind of mentality still stays there, but it's not phrased on religious grounds anymore. And it's interesting, actually, Sarah. You actually mentioned this, I think, in the write-up that you did for advertising this. When we become citizen scientists and we eventually jet off into the stars or whatever, that kind of perspective that time is moving on a linear path and it's going to move towards the end of days, where there's going to be this kind of utopian paradise in heaven when Christ comes back to judge, whatever. That has more or less now been replaced in secular democracies with this kind of like utopian futurism, right? We're kind of aiming towards this idea in society where someday science and technology will get to such a point where all of our material needs will be taken care of. There will be no class. There's a classless society for the most part, and it'll be great. Everything will be wonderful. And that is fundamentally a Christian idea. And that entails this sort of idea of progress where inherently we look back on previous generations and say that they sucked, basically, for lack of a better term, right? That we have increased our knowledge and we know a lot more things than older generations of things. And when it comes to Bacon, that's a large part of his critique of Aristotelian science, right? Or the Aristotelian previous generations of philosophy, because he's coming at it from a perspective and an epistemology that's saying empirical reason is not enough, right? Because the senses can't be trusted. The senses are false. They give us false data. That's why we need technology to, in theory, sort of objectify our perception, because our perceptions and our data or whatever are not good enough. So we need to improve it. But the entire point of technology and modern science for Bacon and Descartes is to control nature. So it's rested on this idea that we treat nature as a resource that can be exploited, and that's the only thing that exists in nature, right? So it's something that's useful. So you're creating knowledge ultimately that is useful. That is useful in the sense of it's in the service of human pleasure and securing sort of the human condition. So advances in medicine or whatever else are great. You compare that to the way that, let's say Plato and Aristotle were doing science. They pursue wisdom for its own sake, not because it's useful, right? So there is something that I think is important. And because Bacon treats the natural world as a resource, that's how we get to this kind of level of forests and landscapes and oceans and all these kinds of things are not treated as living environments with their own diverse ecologies or their own whatever else, right? They are simply just mechanistic oxygen factories, for one thing, or they're just like seas of timber that can be cut down, right? The world is perceived as just this mass of things to be exploited. And when you get to Descartes, we have this idea that, you know, by applying these technologies or whatever else, we become the lord and possessor of nature, right? Like I said. And the whole point is that we get to enjoy the fruits of the earth. I think that's his exact quote. It's very kind of just ethical hedonism, right? It's all phrased through this lens of like, oh, well, the greatest good is pleasure. And as scientists, what we should aim to do is to maximize the amount of pleasure that we have, minimize the amount of pain. And of course, that is equated to what the good is. So when we think about what's good in society, what our role is, it's about maximizing the amount of pleasure that we have. Of course, the problem that you have in that sense is science is very good at that when it's phrased through that kind of philosophy and that kind of ethics. And we can see the evidence of that, right? We have extended life expectancies with all kinds of medications. We've you know, found loads of cures for certain things. We've got people to the moon, to space stations, whatever it is. It works very, very well for that kind of stuff. If that's the ethical paradigm that they're using it for, it impoverishes everything else. I think, you know, so everything else that matters when we're talking about humanities, for instance, right? So the very things that make us human, the foundation of the liberal arts education, all of that's also being cut at the same time, right? So if you look at most of the humanities and liberal arts subjects in universities and departments, they are all being cut right now. So the very things that make us human, which are in themselves sciences, right? They are social sciences. We prioritize. So maybe it's not fair to say, again, not to treat it as a monolithic science, because the social sciences are also being cut. You know, so what we're actually doing, rather than prioritizing one kind of science, what we are actually doing is we are prioritizing and sort of valuing one kind of science above another, and we are devaluing one kind of science over another, mostly because I think we have kind of, especially with AI and stuff on the rise, we have got used to kind of either very strict, very definitive answers about things that come to us very quickly based on the data. And you look at humanities and liberal arts educations, they are very, when you do any kind of research, they're very slow. There is very often times like not one right answer. They require a very huge hermeneutical range and techniques and all that kind of thing. So I think it's probably better to say that we are prioritizing one kind of science and one model of science over another. But I think that is changing, right? So even now, we'll go through a paradigm shift and whatever else, you know, and we have a lot of that kind of stuff with stuff like new realism, new materialism. Panpsychism is also quite popular now, although I have some issues with panpsychism because people tend to treat it like mechanistically as well, which is not really my favorite. But yeah, I think that's the big thing. You know, when you're thinking about Bacon, especially, you have to also take account of his ethics, which is also what we're talking about here as well, about the political nature of science. And you're totally right? He was Lord Chancellor of England. So he comes in and his version of science is very suited to his office and his political office. So when people talk about that science should be apolitical, ideally, yes, absolutely, right? Education and science should be as apolitical as we can get it. Ideally, that's not how it works in practice. It never has historically either. You can't separate science and politics, I don't think. Some people may disagree with me on that, but
I'm thinking about Bacon. I've got to go for dinner, but so I'm going to sign off. I really loved all of that, Chris. What a kind of fantastic mind you have, and everybody here. And just like to kind of, just occurs to me, like in closure around like thinking about Bacon, in that, like he's the kind of microcosm of the macrocosm of what happens when you take this idea of exploiting everything natural and objectifying it and treating it as just as a resource for extractivism, and where that's gotten us, you know, that whole kind of scientific philosophy and the kind of ecological disaster that we're in currently. But we should have kind of paid more attention to Bacon himself, in that, you know, he was killed by one of his own experiments in trying to exploit a chicken, and ended up kind of dying from a frozen chicken experiment, which, you know, probably heralded the kind of whole direction of humanity if they follow a kind of Baconian science. Anyway, I'm heading off for some dinner. I've loved all of this, but it's been really great to chat to you all. See you next time.
Thanks, David. Shauheen, I wanted to bring you in here because you haven't spoken yet, and I know you've got some interesting perspectives on this. Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Danny. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all. Yeah, this is maybe the only thing I want to share is that my background is actually science. I did my PhD in physical chemistry, and this is from back in 2013 that when I was finishing my thesis, I got into a scholarship at University of Austin in Texas, and this was almost like my thesis was done. Like I got this funding, just to go work with a prof, at this research center. That the idea was like, what can I do in, let's say, 6 months, because the funding was only for 6 months, and I decided to actually get an analogy of what I was doing for my PhD into a totally different area. And this new area was, I'm a chemical engineer by background. It was in shale gas, and then basically characterizing how the physics of shale gas is, because these are all like nanometer physics. And that was everything was very new to me. And anyway, so I just went through this 6 month. This was an experimental work, and we came up basically with an article, like a just very interesting part, that when I brought it into my thesis, because my thesis was a combination of different peer-reviewed journals, and I remember that basically the referees, two of them, they told me that because there's nothing about what you're talking about, there's no reference for us to judge this. So basically, I had measured from physics point of view, I had measured the diffusion coefficient of gas into shale material, which is basically shale material is the residue of dinosaurs, which is like deep underneath, and that's how actually when they got to do hydraulic fracking, that's how they got basically America became a oil producing country, because they were able to actually get into the source of material for extraction of oil and gas. So anyway, I finished that. I submitted the paper for peer review, and then I got a job. I went to doing totally different things. And 2 years later, I got into meeting a very well-known prof in the field that he's like a legend. And then he actually started talking about this paper of me, and then he said, "Yeah, I really like that work." And then I got back to Google Scholar, and I saw that like this paper was cited like over 100 times in 2 years. And interestingly, if you search my name, this is actually the paper that's been cited the most, is like over 320 times, like 10 times at least by Nature. And but like this story was very interesting. The whole thing to me came actually from an imagination. So the way that I brought science into something that I had no idea was using science as a tool, just to see how to basically use that as my language to explain physics. And from there, I remember that the rest was just imagination. If you just even look into the paper, I had like a hand drawn like of the molecules of a capillary, and interestingly, that came out as one of the early benchmark sciences, in this space that measured, something that was not measured and that's been cited. And I did nothing with that after that. But to me, that came out as a proof that, there's always a way for, I think it was imagination. It was having the language of science to be able to translate your thoughts into something that is part of the scientific discourse. And I think a big part of it was also bravery of like this prof that I work with, to actually see a value in this and then submit it, and then actually became something that took that received attention. But anyway, to me, that was like a personal experience of like the way that like you can actually bring imagination into science, and then with analogy of what is closer to that, use the language of science, and then bring it to reality as a method of measurement. And like later on, like in the past 7-8 years, I've been working on. I kind of like deviated to work on plant sciences and phytochemistry, and like from there to psychoactive materials and psychedelics, etc. Back in 2021, we started our like drug discovery company. That for me, that was my exposure to like how a real drug for FDA is actually being made, and our focus was natural plants and polypharmacology, that these are all the things that the FDA doesn't really like because there's no way to actually like combine things from a toxicology or ADMET, evaluation. It actually becomes very expensive, and they really like single molecules that does one thing on a receptor profile. But my experience was just like going through DSM, like being focused on two pathology, and then like what you can bring as an indication, like how you can actually study the mechanism of action of the pathology, and then mechanism of action of the cure. It was very interesting from that perspective that like this field is actually a very complex field. It's very multidisciplinary. Most of the people in the field are psychologists or neuroscientists or are pharmacologists, but this is like literally not even if not a triangle. You have to be a neuropsychopharmacologist to really understand all aspects of creating a drug for the body neuroscientifically, and also something that pharmacologically work. And then there's all kinds of uncertainties on every edge of that. Yeah, so, but at the end of the day, I think what actually brought me, because I was totally coming into, and people were laughing at us because people are coming, from big pharma that talks about these type of things, and we were coming, totally from a very different background. But my understanding was that I was understanding way more than many of the psychiatrists in the field in terms of like how to relate a pathology to science. And interestingly, I think a big part of that is actually related to how like of an empath you can be to actually relate to somebody who is going through a pathology, versus if you go through a check mark of DSM to see if they have all the symptoms. So yeah, I think from a scientific point of view, I think you have to see what's available as a diligent way, with the scientific community to use those, and then what can again be part of the big discourse, within the realm of, like the language of science. And then still, like if you want to bring innovation, I think imagination is a big part of what you do, and also just like bravery and like a little bit of just being okay to be rejected by the scientific community, because otherwise it's very difficult to always stay within or underneath the threshold and then trying to do something that is groundbreaking. But I think also science is as Danny said, there's a lot of good science actually coming from these ancient books. For example, when I was reading from Avicenna's book on the Book of Canon, which is about herbs, and at that point I was working on cannabis and the pharmacology of cannabis. Like you see that like there's just one line from that book which only has like a section about cannabis that is totally relevant to what a sativa versus indica, like a strain could, could have a different effect, or could like from an entourage effect, can have an, like different influence on people. Anyway, like very interestingly, I just recently was part of a Sufi retreat in Toronto, and this is part of the Inayat Khan lineage, I actually ran into this book. I'm not sure. I just wanted to drop this as well. Like that, this book that is called the 50. I'm not sure if you've heard about it. It's called the 50 Kamarupa verses. There's actually part of a book that apparently this is coming from the yogic practices of about 13. Basically, the book was found in 1358 in Persian, and it was translated later on. But the whole science is about the science of imagination and breath together, and how they are related. And interestingly, the way that the translation is all about like if you want to do something, basically you just go through the flow of breath from your left or right nostril. And then basically you get to get confirmation about the events, that is ahead of you, depending on like if the breath is coming like more openly from the right nostril or the left nostril. I'm sure that like if you just get to bring this whole book into, use AI just to see, what are the similarities, from like all the, for example, like I want to just like read you from one verse of it. It says that if you want to study science or wishes to send a child to school, it should be from the left breath, or like, and then if you want to go to war, if you want to do things like that, you get confirmation from the imagination and breath. And I'm sure that there has been, there is a science behind it, but we are not really able to maybe see the relational, of the parameters here. Anyway, I think that for me, a scientist or psychiatrist that was very inspiring in the field was Claudio Naranjo, which, depending based on the work that I work on hormonal compounds, he actually was very brave to go and inject harmaline into basically just IV harmaline into patients that was suffering from deep depression. And if you read his work, it's actually very inspirational in terms of like what he actually got from that. And it was totally left. This is from 1964, and there's not much done after that. But anyway, I thought that sharing my experience with science and the age of science would be of value.
Thank you very much, Shauheen. I love that. I might need that book for the Oracle Dream Retreat next year, because there are I think viewing the world and the cosmos as being oracular is something that can kind of instantly change our perspective on the world. If we think of the world as communicating the future to us all the time, I think it gets to something closer to ancient or small-scale society perception, because there is that conversation and that dialogue that when you're in your little flat or in your little house, when you don't have a garden, you can be cut off from sometimes. But I'm writing an article at the moment about the Oracle of Dodona, which is one of the Oracle sites we're going to be visiting next year. And I find it so interesting. There's basically a lot of oracles involve a kind of incoherence pattern from which coherence is born. And at Dodona, you have the rustling of oak leaves, or the trickling of a stream, or the sound of doves. And at Siwa Oasis, you have a golden statue of a god in a boat that's transported by priests and moves around. And it's that hidden hand directing. I suppose science, because it's so concerned with the material world, doesn't have a framework to make sense of the invisible world, which is something that the study of quantum physics or molecular biology or whatever is kind of started to understand. But there's an invisible spirit dimension, I think, that just cannot be included in ordinary modern scientific conversations, because it's a philosophy that we have rejected, essentially, generally speaking, kind of like someone mentioned throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I think that's something that everyone seems to be doing these days, like with this kind of divisive nature of social media, with this divisive nature, or something has to be either true or false. And when we throw the baby out with the bathwater, we're really missing some of that nutrient-rich baby bathwater that we could probably be doing with. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming along this afternoon. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really inspiring, and I'm looking forward to dreaming upon it this evening. And actually, what I'm trying to do with these panels is every panel brings up an idea for the next one. And so for the next one, I want to do magic, which I know a lot of people will be interested in. And I think it fits nicely into leading on from science. So thank you so much, everyone. I've really enjoyed it. And I will share this recording on YouTube shortly. Thank you.